Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kaylee Lines.
The Strait is still closed as the Pentagon promises the heaviest day of bombing yet. Welcome to the Friday edition as the conflict with Iran approaches the 2-week mark. And now news of 6 more Americans killed in action. I'm Joe Mathieu, alongside Tyler Kendall, who's in for Kaylee today in Washington. Tyler, that number ticking up today as we understand the full crew on that air-to-air refueler perished in that crash yesterday in Iraq.
We did get an update earlier today from U.S. officials, including the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, who offered his condolences and says that they are conducting an investigation into that incident. As officials outlined, that it doesn't appear that we are any closer to an end in this conflict. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saying that the U.S. has so far hit 15,000 Iranian targets along with Israel. 15,000
targets just a day after President Trump said we're practically out of targets. And apparently we found some, because they are promising the heaviest, the most intense day of bombing yet, with the Strait that is still largely closed, although apparently the Iranians allowed a couple of ships to pass through. They're just not flagged for the U.S.
Right. Reports about Indian flag vessels, also perhaps a Turkish flag vessel, according to one Turkish official. Now, the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, was asked about this, and he said, quote, "We've been dealing with it, but we know it's the number one thing contributing to oil supply disruptions," which, of course, the markets are watching. So as we always start, we're going to head over to Charlie Pellet for a look on all of the action and what's going on. Hey, Charlie.
And hello. We are looking at a down day for the U.S. equity market, but right now, got to begin with crude oil. That is the big story right now, with West Texas Intermediate crude at $96.83 a barrel. WTI up by 1.1%. Brent at 101.44 right now. Barrel of Brent up by 1%. Bottom line here, equities lower. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red. At one point, we did have the S&P 500 index higher by 1%, but right now looking at a loss of 0.4 on the S&P, down 26 points, a decline there of just about 0.1%. NASDAQ down 187 for NASDAQ, a decline of just about 0.8%. The VIX above 27, the 10-year 4.28%. Gold down $29 the ounce to $5,049, drop there of 0.6%. Again, crude bears repeating. WTI closing in on 97, up 1.1%, and Brent above 101 now, up by about 1%. Oil shares are advancing. USO, that is the oil ETF, the United States Oil Fund, it is advancing by just about 0.1%. ExxonMobil among the oil majors up 1.5%. Chevron down 0.5%. ConocoPhillips right now up by about 0.8%. So recapping a down day here, 3 hours to go ahead of the closing bell. S&P down 0.4%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Tyler Kendall.
All right, Charlie, thanks so much. As Charlie mentioned, I'm Tyler Kendall here in Washington alongside Joe Mathieu. We'll check in with Charlie Pellet later in the program as the U.S. threatens that the war with Iran is going to intensify. We heard from President Trump in a post earlier today saying that the U.S. has unlimited ammunition and that the U.S. has, quote, plenty of time. This came right before a briefing from senior U.S. officials, including the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who is confirming that the U.S. and Israel have hit more than 15,000 targets and says that Iran's one-way drone capability is now down 95%.
That the United States is decimating the radical Iranian regime's military in a way the world has never seen before. Never before has a modern, capable military, which Iran used to have, been so quickly destroyed and made combat ineffective, devastated.
It's about to get more devastating. According to the Secretary of Defense, this will be the most intense day of bombing yet. And if you read the president's post on Truth Social, they are consistent. We have, quote, unparalleled firepower, the president writes, unlimited ammunition, and plenty of time. He says, watch what happens to these deranged scumbags today. Jennifer Welch has been leading our coverage here at Bloomberg Economics, our chief geoeconomics analyst when it comes to not only the status of the war on the ground here, but its impact on the economy and, of course, energy prices. Jenny, it's great to see you and welcome back to Balance of Power. What do we make of this moment that we're in with a market that's fearing going long into the weekend? What might happen in the next couple of days?
Well, I think it's really introducing questions about what President Trump had said earlier in the week, that he expected that the war would end very soon, although he had caveated probably not this week. It looks like it might not be next week either. But I think what we're seeing here is a continuation of defiance on both sides, because not only do you have the U.S. saying that we're continuing to escalate strikes on Iran, that we are continuing to move into even closer targeting of targets and assets there, even though many of them have already been hit. But you also have Iran coming out with this very defiant statement from its new supreme leader, promising to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed and to open new fronts in the conflict if the United States and Israel continue to expand. And I think what all of that suggests is that the timeline for this war remains very uncertain, but it certainly doesn't look like there is an end in sight for now.
Well, we're talking about potential escalation. We heard earlier this week from President Trump that potentially we could see the U.S. hit electricity infrastructure if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. We now have reporting that Israel is going after oil infrastructure. Jenny, just how big of an escalation would this be if we see continued attacks against these energy infrastructure assets?
Well, I think in addition to that, there's the question that was raised by Secretary of War Hegseth's remarks earlier when he commented that Iran's new supreme leader had been injured by strikes. So in addition to the targeting of infrastructure, there's questions about continued targeting of the leadership and how that could or could not harden Iran's resolve here. But I think the other question is, to what extent are the U.S. and Israel still aligned on the tactics of this war? We recall earlier this week, there was some questioning in Washington of those Israeli strikes on oil infrastructure in Iran. And I think there is a risk here of divergence between these two partners that up until now have been operating largely in lockstep.
What would be the impact on energy prices, for instance? I don't know what the status of the strait would be, but if the United States feels that it's reached its objectives, say we find that enriched uranium or we decapitate the regime, whatever it is that we qualify as victory, and Israel continues its campaign, do we have the same factor for energy prices that we have now?
I think we would expect that if Israel continues fighting on, which is very plausible, aims on both sides in terms of the U.S. and Israel have been somewhat vague, but at both times, both leaders have talked about something as drastic as regime change or massive instability in Iran, which obviously hasn't happened yet. So if Israel were to continue fighting in pursuit of that aim, then we would expect Iran would continue to hold shipping in the Strait of Hormuz at risk and continue to attempt to pose risks to other energy infrastructure in the region. And what that means for oil markets is that if we see these disruptions persist, we're already, as you mentioned, almost 14 days into this conflict, for several more weeks, we could not only see oil continue to tick up where it is now, a little bit above $100 a barrel, but rise even higher. We've estimated that if the disruptions persist for closer to 3 months, you could see oil well above $150 a barrel, maybe even closer to, we estimate, around $164.
What about the potential impacts of the actions that the Trump administration is already taking to try to mitigate some of the supply disruptions, including overnight announcing that they're going to ease some sanctions related to Russian oil, issuing a second temporary waiver for buyers to purchase some of those cargoes that are already at sea? Jenny, should we expect more of this type of action from the administration? And I'm also wondering how our regional allies are viewing a move like this that does ease some of that pain when it comes to Russia.
Some of these moves, including the waiving of the Jones Act, the release of strategic petroleum reserves, it's definitely going to have a cushioning effect. But in the long run, what's really going to drive markets and drive energy supplies is gaining access back to all of those oil and gas supplies that are right now locked up in the Gulf, that in some cases they've turned off production because storage tanks have become so full since they can't export any of them. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that those sanctions waivers were largely into response what many countries were already starting to do, recognizing there was a pinch in supplies in the Middle East. They were already starting to look to that Russian oil, and it's probably going to have limited impact here in the U.S. The Jones Act will probably take a few cents off, the cost of a tank of gasoline, but even that will be relatively minimal. And then the release of the strategic petroleum reserves, the IEA has been coordinating about 400 million gallons across the world. That will take time to hit in terms of when those reserves are released, the tempo at which they are released, and will only amount to about 20 days worth of supply from the Strait of Hormuz. So if this conflict ends in the next few days, before we hit the 20-day mark, it will have a good effect. If it extends much past that, then it will really only be a temporary comfort.
All right, Jenny. We understand, according to Bloomberg News reporting, that several back channels have opened just in the past couple of days between Tehran and U.S. allies when it comes to reopening the strait. What could this result in? An actual ceasefire or an agreement to open the strait? Or could it be an agreement to open the strait for only select nations?
I think at the moment what we're probably seeing is a mix of both. There's probably efforts to try and breach a longer ceasefire, but the two sides are very far apart on what that would entail. For example, Iran wants to see guarantees that it won't be reattacked, something that the U.S. and Israel probably aren't willing to offer. And it wants to see sanctions relief, which I think will also be a stretch. The U.S. may want to see Iran make guarantees on its nuclear and missile program, which it wasn't willing to do before the war and probably is even less willing to do now. And in the meantime, I think we see a lot of countries trying to engage Tehran directly to seek the ability for their own ships or ships that are headed towards them to gain access so that they can get their energy supplies.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jennifer Welch, Bloomberg Economics Chief Geoeconomics Analyst, thank you so much for all of your insights. And we do want to extend the conversation by bringing in today's political panel. That's Jeanne Zaino, Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center and a Bloomberg Politics contributor, as well as Rosemary Becchi, partner at Brownstein Hyatt and Republican strategist. Rosemary, I want to start with you and pick up on what we were just discussing when it comes to oil prices that are now hitting Americans, including when it comes to retail gasoline. How much pressure is there on President Trump to pull some of these other levers beyond waiving some oil sanctions on Russia, but perhaps invoking and waiving the Jones Act, maybe asking for a federal gas tax holiday? How likely is it that we're going to see some other moves out of the administration?
So I think that as your previous guest talked about, to the extent that this continues, more and more pressure is going to be on the president to look at other means of reducing, the price at the pump. The longer this continues, it again creates such pressure to do something about it. And particularly, again, as we kind of get towards the midterms, right? I think that, as we saw in the last election cycle, that, Americans aren't feeling better off and that, they are concerned about affordability. And so I do think that, the president and others are recognizing that. And I think that ultimately they will be looking to do other things to bring down, the price of gas. Remember, during the State of the Union, he did talk about how low gas prices are. So the last thing you want to see is them, climbing higher and higher.
We want to make note, by the way, that we had an update from CENTCOM and from the Pentagon earlier today to learn that 2 more Americans were killed in action after a U.S. refueling airplane crashed in western Iraq. All 6 crew members have died. Initial reports were that 4 of the 6 had been lost. And we heard about the Americans who were lost this morning from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Jeanne, Dan Kane. It's always the first thing that he acknowledges when they hold these morning briefings at the Pentagon, before he gets to any of the X's and O's or any of the threats against Iran, before he starts taking questions. The Secretary of Defense obviously has a very different approach here, civilian leadership, a former Fox News personality, and of course a veteran himself. He spent quite a lengthy period of time chastising the press that at least were assembled for this morning event, Jeanne, and he even tried to rewrite some of the headlines that he had been seeing, telling them how to better do their jobs when it comes to covering the war. And it was a long time before he got to Americans who had been injured or perished in battle. What do you make of the dichotomy between these two?
It expresses their concerns, right? On the one hand, you have Kane, who rightly so starts with the horrific death and killing of these American soldiers, these American heroes. And I listened to that as well, Joe, and his tone is absolutely on point. These people, their families, I mean, you just think about how horrifying this is. And then you flip over to a Secretary of Defense, or War, as he likes to talk about, and you see what he values and what is most important to him. And that is how he and his mission are represented in the press. This is a person who has cut off the legacy traditional press out of the briefings, thinking that if he did that, he could control the narrative. He's woken up to what we all knew. There's no controlling that narrative. And now he is taken to chastising them. But the reality is he's doing so at a time when he should be mourning the loss of these heroes. And I think it just reflects where his interests are and where his focus is. And it is not where it should be. And I applaud Dan Kane for having the right value system and putting that front and center.
Well, 13 U.S. service members have been killed since the war started. Rosemary, let's get your thoughts here on the administration's messaging when it comes to this, but then also about what tactical success and objectives look like on the ground, because we've been talking about it all week here. The markets are watching very closely. Everybody is watching very closely on what the potential timeline is going to be. And we've heard some mixed signals, right? President Trump saying that this could be over as soon as he wants it to, but then also saying in a post earlier today that the U.S. is willing to sustain this for as long as it takes.
So, I mean, obviously, you know, the goal here is to get this over with as quickly as possible. I mean, I don't think the goals have changed here, right? I think the goals is to get a regime change in place. The goal is not to have boots on the ground. And I still think that the administration and the president are pushing for this. And I don't think the messaging has changed. And maybe we just need to continue to remind everybody that this is about keeping Americans safe. This is, you know, was part of the president's agenda. And I think that we just, you know, need to be reminding everyone of that. And hopefully, you know, this will move quickly and we will see a resolution shortly. But I do think that there's still a commitment towards, you know, making sure there is no boots on the ground and that we resolve this as quickly as possible. And we do see a regime change here.
Jeanne, we only have a minute left. I'm taken by this poll from Quinnipiac University that finds a whopping number. 77% of Americans think a terror attack is likely because of this, or in response to the military action against Iran. It's more like 30 seconds at this point. If such an attack occurs, does that strengthen the resolve of the American people or create more opposition to the conflict?
You know, I think it'll strengthen their resolve to defend the homeland, but I think it will also underscore what a misguided situation we are in at the hands of an administration with no clear goals or ability to achieve them in a war that he said he wouldn't start and has now gotten us into. And we will have boots on the ground because that's the only way you can get that 900 pounds of uranium out.
We'll be talking about that if it happens, Jeanne. Great panel, and thank you both, Jeanne Zaino and Rosemary Becchi. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
And I'm Tyler Kendall here in Washington with Joe Mathieu. And as we continue to cover the updates related to the conflict with Iran, the idea of artificial intelligence and the battlefield keeps coming up in conversations. And we're tracking developments in the ongoing dispute between Anthropic and the Pentagon over the company's demands for safeguards in exchange for the military using its AI tools. The Trump administration moved to designate Anthropic a supply chain risk. And Joe, now the company is suing over this, telling a judge earlier this week that it is poised to lose potentially billions of dollars in revenue because of the decision.
Yeah, it could, be a massive impact on its business. It's a $200 million contract with the Pentagon, but as we've discussed with Mike Shepard before, if you unwind all of its operations with every other defense contractor or any company that's doing business with the Pentagon, that number gets a lot bigger. So we did want to update things because this has been a dicey week for Anthropic, and it's a precedent-setting moment at the Pentagon and beyond when we start looking at the use of artificial intelligence technology. Mike is Bloomberg Senior Editor for Technology and Strategic Industries. And Shep, it's great to have you as always here. So we've got the lawsuit. But the fact is, as I understand it at least, and I'd love to know what you're hearing, Anthropic is still being used, and it could be for the next 6 months by the Pentagon, even as we wage war against Iran.
It is still being used. And there really is the conundrum in a way that the Pentagon, on the one hand, is saying that because you won't abide by our terms, the government's terms, you are now a supply chain risk, and yet we need your technology for the next 6 months until we find a suitable replacement. There is an inherent contradiction, and that is one that has been highlighted in the government's case. And there are some companies that are not only waiting in the wings, but really stepping forward to try to perhaps take some of that business. OpenAI, most obviously, and perhaps brazenly, certainly in Anthropic's view, stepped in hours after President Donald Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ordered that the company be declared a supply chain risk and debarred from federal business. They stepped in with their own version of proposal for classified work. And then we have also seen XAI, Elon Musk's AI venture, step in with a plan and approval to do classified work as well. But neither is as fully advanced as Anthropic has been with its Claude tool.
So there's these discussions with some other AI tools and companies in the Pentagon. There's now these 2 lawsuits that Anthropic has brought, I believe one in California, one here in Washington. Are there any discussions between the company and the Pentagon that we know about outside of the legal matter here? Is there another viable off-ramp for this
Tyler,
dispute?
this is really the heart of the matter, because in every single other dispute, whether it be an antitrust case, you name it, the parties always try to talk behind the scenes to see if they can maybe diffuse things and not have to go all the way through the whole rigmarole of the courts, and then maybe lead to an outcome that is less than satisfying. To be clear, the Pentagon wants to keep using Anthropic's tools. The defense personnel who have been employing them through classified and unclassified platforms really like them. They're adaptable, and in much the same way that across the business world, those tools have been embraced in a lot of different ways. So too in the government. And yet there is this conflict over the terms. Now, as for talks, we interviewed the Pentagon official who's been leading these discussions. And at the beginning of the week, he flatly said that, nope, talks are over, we're moving on. But this is the Trump administration, and we know that never really doesn't always mean never.
I wonder if the Pentagon has a point, Mike, and we get to the philosophical or sort of moral, ethical problem here. They want a product that they can use as they see fit. They don't want a company telling them how to use it. That would be no different than Boeing or Lockheed or General Dynamics or Raytheon, right? We're selling you missiles, but you're going to use those missiles as you see fit. We can't attach strings to them. Why should AI be different?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm glad you brought up the analogy between other defense contractors, because the ones that are providing those sorts of armaments for kinetic purposes, like a bomb or a missile, they don't have a little asterisk there saying, you got to come back to us if this use case comes up. Doesn't happen. In this situation, though, what Dario Amodei, this chief executive of Anthropic, is arguing is that, look, this technology is still so nascent and error-prone, we do not trust it for using it yet in fully autonomous weapons. It's like, we can't go there. And the Pentagon is saying, look, there is no such thing. We don't do that yet. There is always a human involved in the chain. And yet Anthropic is concerned that that could be a slippery slope. And then there is the other point that Anthropic has really drawn a red line on, and that is surveillance. And their concern is that this technology could also be used somehow, intentionally or unintentionally, to conduct domestic surveillance on American citizens. And that's also a red line for them. And again, so when you think about Boeing or Raytheon, the analogy works, but only up to a point if you hear Dario Amodei.
So given that the dispute over these use cases has not been resolved, it's my understanding that there is now this 6-month phase out for the technology. How doable is that? And could we see the legal matter resolved faster than that? What's the timeline we're looking at here?
Well, the timeline is really fluid now because it's unclear what happens if and when one of the judges in California or here in Washington issues a temporary restraining order. Does that stop the clock altogether? And then as far as the adaptation to another provider, another technology, say OpenAI, XAI, or even Google, which this week has been ported on to provide unclassified work for the Pentagon, it would take some time. We have talked to experts who do not only procurement, but specialize in technology with the Pentagon, and they said, look, it would be a little bit messy, but eventually you could find something that would plug in. Now, the question, though, Tyler, is would the user experience and the effectiveness of the technology be quite the same in this sense?
All right. Bloomberg's Michael Shepard, senior editor for technology and strategic industries. He always has the latest on this, Mike. Thanks you. Joe. And Joe, this is perhaps the perfect way to bridge domestic and foreign policy. The Pentagon is the federal government's largest tech buyer. And as you were asking in that question, the Pentagon maintains that it doesn't want to use Anthropic's tools and in those ways that Anthropic is looking for those safeguards. But at this point, it's not enough for the company. That's
absolutely right. And whether this is something that progresses from here has yet to be seen. In the next 6 months, as this technology is unwound, maybe a new precedent will be set. But it's an interesting moment that we're in right now with this, obviously, conflict with Iran that Anthropic is now tied into. It's happening at a time when domestic terror threats have returned to the conversation. I alluded earlier to this Quinnipiac poll. 77% of Americans think there will be a terror attack on American soil because of this conflict. And it's coming at a time when the Department of Homeland Security is closed. I believe we're at the 1 month mark tomorrow. The first paycheck for TSA is being missed today. The timing here, Tyler, is potentially terrible.
And it's 206,000 employees in the Department of Homeland Security. And you're starting to see the calls from Republicans in particular that they have to get a move on when it comes to funding DHS amid, as you're outlining, there is a renewed threat when it comes to Iran. We had President Trump earlier today, one headline crossing the terminal about sleeper cells, though he says the U.S. knows where they all are and there shouldn't be a concern.
Yeah, he was talking to Fox News, I believe, about that. It's the first time we ever heard a number on that. But we thought we'd compare notes with Nathan Dean before we get into the weekend here, just to have a sense of how long maybe this goes. He's, of course, a Bloomberg Intelligence senior U.S. policy analyst. Nathan, it's great to have you back here. We wanted to pull you in on the day that the first full paycheck is being missed to ask whether this new pressure point might make a difference.
So it's not right now. I mean, if you go to social media, you'll see the Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats almost say the same message. They'll retweet a long line at an airport and say that the other party is responsible for this.
Yes,
right. And, we do think that the TSA sick-outs are going to bring a resolution to this, but we're just not in the stage yet of the negotiations. So look, there haven't been really many negotiations whatsoever. Right. And so we think this probably takes another week, if not a little bit longer, to get to some type of resolution. But really, whatever it's not, I mean, whatever that resolution is, essentially we think that when this is done, we should be good through September 30th, and that should be it for the rest of the shutdowns.
Wow.
So that's funding for DHS. We also know that, relatedly, Congress is preparing for a supplemental request from the Pentagon to help sustain what is happening in the Middle East. Do we have any idea how big of a supplemental request this is going to be and how easily or not so easily it would get past Congress?
So Bloomberg News has reported this idea of $50 billion, and we've done some analysis showing what that would potentially look like in terms of munitions. Some people have said north of $100 billion, maybe $150 billion, but we would caution clients to say is that any single time you see a number here, there's always going to be somebody else saying, look, we need to attach something. And we've seen reporting that says that $15 billion worth of farmer aid could be attached to this. So where I'm going with this is that we do think this number is going to be close to $100 billion or just north of $100 billion. But the question is it going to go through reconciliation or is it going to go through normal order? If this bill is very small, say 50 to 100 billion, farm aid plus Iran supplemental, and it goes through normal order, we think this can actually pass. If it goes through reconciliation, every lobbyist in town, every policymaker is going to say, we'll attach something. And next thing you know, blows up to $1 trillion package. And with a margin of vote of 1 in the House of Representatives, we just don't think that would happen.
It's almost like you've seen this happen before. Nathan, I've got to ask you just quickly, we've got a minute left. Next week, SAVE Act. John Thune says, I'm bringing it to the floor. He doesn't have the votes. But we're talking about days upon days of debate?
Probably. I mean, look, Senator Thune has to go through the motions of bringing it to the floor. This is something the Republicans, and especially President Trump, want to have happened. But Senator Thune obviously has said he doesn't have the votes to change the filibuster. And at the end of the day, the SAVE Act would require 60 votes to pass. And we just don't see that happening anytime soon.
All right. You got it straight from Nathan Dean, and that's the authority around here in the D.C. Bureau. Bloomberg Intelligence Senior U.S. Policy Analyst. Nathan, thank you. Try to get a weekend because we're going to pick this up all over again on Monday. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall in Washington, and we appreciate your spending some time with us here on the Friday edition of Balance of Power. A special conversation ahead. We'll look at the markets as we always do with Charlie Pellet, but a special conversation with a former CIA agent who is getting into private enterprise to seize on the very technology we were talking to Shep about, and that's AI.
Right, from CIA to CEO. We're going to have those details up next. Stick with us. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. As the conflict in Iran reaches its 13th day, there is a lot of conversation here in Washington about revitalizing the defense industrial base, replenishing weapon stockpiles. As the U.S. confirms earlier today, it has hit more than 15,000 targets in Iran. The same goes in Europe, where NATO members are now continuing their push to spend more on their defense systems amid broader pressure from President Trump for those allies to boost their defense budgets. On the latest edition of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, David Weston takes a look at how Sweden is playing a larger role in the European defense manufacturing base.
I know we say that, Europe is rearming. But the reality is that Europe as a whole is not rearming. There is a limited number of countries that rearm. That includes at least 2 big ones. First and foremost, of course, Germany, the other one being Poland, and then a number of smaller countries, particularly in Scandinavia and other parts of Eastern Europe. And these are countries that actually do have, if you like, latent fiscal capacity. Germany, again, being the case in point. And therefore, there is a self-selection. The countries that can have both guns and butter, well, they're rearming. But those that have to choose, and by that I mean France, Italy, Spain, the UK, they are much more hesitant when it comes to significantly increasing defense expenditures.
Defense has the potential to become a stronger economic driver across Europe. The EU is targeting 50% of defense procurement to be from EU suppliers by 2030, a meaningful shift considering that after Russia's invasion, that number was roughly 25%. But meeting that goal requires production capacity, and that's where Sweden stands out. It has maintained that production capacity for the better part of a century, in part because it historically relied more on exports than other European manufacturers, and that continuity matters.
There's a, I would say, dramatic ramp up in spending right now, but there were years where there was not as much attention or investment in Europe in defense. How did Saab maintain its investments?
Well, we have never sort of dismantled sort of everything, as you are alluding to, within our company, and that goes back to our ownership, I think. Even though we are a stock exchange company, publicly listed, we have a strong owner in the Wallenberg family. And they have always been long-term and also very loyal to sort of the deterrence and defense of Sweden for many, many decades. And so we never dismantled. We continuously invested more on our own, I would say, when sort of the government didn't sort of fund everything that we wanted them to fund. And we have always been a company that takes sort of a lot of our top line and our bottom line, for that sake, to reinvest in R&D, to always be relevant in the short time frame, but also long term. So we are a bit unique in that sense, I think, not only looking at relying upon governments all the time to keep our operations efficient and state-of-the-art.
I can't wait to see this whole thing, and you'll have a chance to, along with us this evening on Bloomberg Wall Street Week with our colleague David Weston, and that starts after the late edition of Balance of Power. Check it out at 6 p.m. Eastern Time as part of our day-long conversation here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you for being with us on the Friday edition. We promised you an important conversation, and we bring it to you now with the headline on the terminal. Tech-savvy spies step out of the shadows and into the boardroom. It's a fascinating moment for former CIA officers to bring their experience in the field to bear in the private sector, and in this case, in the market for security-focused tech firms. There's one in particular that was launched not very long ago by Brian Carbaugh, former CIA officer. And it's a company that is actually harnessing the very technology that we were discussing earlier with Mike Shepard, and that's artificial intelligence. Andesite is the name of the company, and that former CIA officer, Brian Carbaugh, is with us right now. Brian, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
We should start by thanking you for your service, and I know that from the if you tell me you'd have to kill me file, there's probably not a lot you could tell us about your resume, but you were part of the CIA Jawbreaker program. You're the real deal, and you had the opportunity in that experience to realize what you didn't have but wanted. Now it's your opportunity to create that technology to help our men and women in the field. Andesite is compiling massive amounts of data to do what with in combat?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. For me, going back to that experience in Afghanistan after 9/11, obviously speed was essential. We had to move very quickly. The threats were compounding. All of us who were on those first waves in Afghanistan knew that our country was at risk. The attacks were going to multiply. And what mattered was trying to get the information not just fast enough, but also to have the type of context that you needed, to have the type of insight that you needed to sort of make decisions quickly and act on those decisions. And for sure, everyone across the intelligence community and the special operations forces, of which I was a member on the Jawbreaker team, was moving with the best of intentions, but you just had massive amounts of information piling up. And again, everyone was searching for that context. So we found ourselves moving from village to village, town to town, province to province, oftentimes acting on quick tips. But what we needed was that sort of combined, coalesced provision of contextualized information that gave us the type of insight we needed to act. So in Andesite, to your point, we're now using artificial intelligence to move at speed, to deal with the volumes of data that we have. So in this case, it's not the special operations troops who are on the ground as we were back after 9/11, but it's the cyber defenders who are working so hard to protect our public service and private sector institutions from the growing threat of cyber attacks.
How much has the landscape shifted since you were on the ground to today with the advent of AI? How is that really changing the picture when it comes to the U.S.'s preparedness and its response to threats?
Dramatically. I think in this case now you see that AI is really the attacker. So you're seeing those types of either hacktivist groups or hostile countries who are using AI in the offense. I think that's changed the landscape quite dramatically. And when you're dealing with entities who really aren't bound by law, they're not bound by moral norms, they're not bound by ethics as we are in the West, then it certainly AI can provide an opportunity for the attackers to move quite quickly. And the challenge is now on the defense. We have to move at that same type of speed and alacrity.
Just to digress for one moment into a conversation or debate that's been happening in the markets here, there's been a thought that AI might replace the need for cyber protection, that in fact they're somehow competing with each other. You're using them together. Isn't the onset of AI creating more demand for cyber protection?
I think it does, precisely for one of the reasons we just mentioned. We're seeing attackers who are using AI.
As opposed to replacing these platforms, though. How are you marrying them together?
For sure. A quick background, my thought on that. When I look at the aspects of my time at CIA from which I draw the most satisfaction and sort of gratification, it was really the power of the team. So it was that human team that was able to harness technology, to use technology as an enabler. It was diverse teams with different types of backgrounds that came together unified by a mission to really solve hard problems. At Andesite, we're taking that same approach. So we build a culture that's really powerfully enabling, that both within our company and for our customers, we say that we think the human beings are central to using AI to address these problems. I think, as we look at the power and promise of AI, it offers immense opportunity in dealing with volume, but we think even the U.S. intelligence community I'd seen with greater signals intelligence collection, more volume of data, you lose context and you lose that awareness.
Yeah.
Having the human being be at the helm is core to what we do, so that the human can use that which is uniquely human in the end, which is to use their judgment to make those decisions.
Well, that's incredibly important. Will that always be the case for AI, or is that the space we're in right now?
I think when we look at the power of generative AI, it's important for us to remember that as it stands right now, it's not deterministic.
Got it.
It makes mistakes. It makes inferences that are not correct. It can say and do things that are inaccurate. And if we're using AI to generate a poem, that might be sort of comedic, but when you're trying to protect your perimeter security inside a network, it's less funny. So we think that, as the AI improves, as the accuracy and credibility improve, then for sure within Andesite, we'll automate more of the workflow. But we think the right architecture, the right decision is to empower the human to be at the helm, make those decisions, really sort of enabled and enhanced by the power of AI.
So what sort of guardrails or safeguards would you think would be the right way for the administration, for the federal government to be thinking about this? And I'm also curious about who you work with, the public and the private sectors. Do they have different needs when it comes to this and to this broader discussion about keeping consumers of this safe?
Yeah, I think to the different needs, one thing I'd say is we think the threat vectors are the same. So the threat actors, the types of attacks that, whether it's public or private sector institutions, the threat is the same and it's growing. I'm most concerned when I look at the difference between public and private sector at where the private sector stands in terms of risk. I think public sector institutions have, in many cases, large, sort of well-defended networks. There's there's a defense in depth. There's layered cyber defenses. When I look at private sector entities, particularly businesses with a global footprint, with potentially international, geographically dispersed supply chains, there's risk there. And I think certainly in today's environment, any businesses that are interacting with our counterparts in Israel are at a heightened degree of risk. So I think in the private sector, there's real risk there. And there's also been a blurring of the risk where you look at critical infrastructure like hospital systems, the energy infrastructure, financial services institutions. More and more that infrastructure is in private sector hands. So it's not as sort of tidily categorized as to say public and private sector because that risk is shared.
That's really interesting. Brian, I want to get back to where we started here. And that's essentially a new breed of CEOs like yourself, former CIA officers, in some cases, former members of the military who can take their active duty experience and apply it in these cases. Timing is everything, and timing is apparently on your side right here. Do you feel like you're part of a growing community doing this with your experience as a veteran?
I do. I'm starting to see more and more teammates of mine, both from CIA, the National Security Agency, the Special Operations Forces, and the U.S. military, I think feel the same way perhaps that I do, which is, I was drawn to public service. I spent 30 plus years in public service. It mattered to me. There's nobility in that mission. And I think to the conversation we're having here, when you look at the vulnerability of our energy systems, our hospital and medical systems, you look at the attack that just happened this week, this matters. And to the extent that we can draw from the type of cultural experiences we had, the types of environments in which we operated to try to apply those skills and experiences in building a business to help address these types of attacks, then I'm absolutely grateful for the opportunity.
Joe mentioned the timing. We're also seeing an administration that's trying to boost defense budgets. I believe President Trump's request for the Pentagon next year would boost it by about 50%. How much is this a boon to your industry and the support that we could see for making sure that we're bolstering our technology in the name of defense of the U.S.?
I think it's a recognition that in light of what's happening right now and with an eye to the future, that the threats will continue to grow. So resourcing cyber defense systems and technologies, resourcing the public sector defense of our cyber systems is critically important. So to be able to play a part in that and be a part of a team, again, of some pretty extraordinary people who are part of a really powerful network, it's a great opportunity, and certainly it's the right time.
All right, Brian Carbaugh, CEO and co-founder of Andesite. It was so great having you here in studio. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Congrats on your company. We'd love to hear more about how it grows in the near term. You're based right here in Virginia, where we are in the nation's capital. Tyler, the President of the United States likes to talk about central casting. I don't know where they found this man, but I think he used to work for the CIA. It's great to meet Brian, and we thank him for his service. We'll meet you back here on the late edition of Balance of Power. That starts at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Think of what could happen between now and then. They've got the rodeo winners at the White House, Tyler.
They do, but that event is still closed to the press, I think, to our dismay. But we'll be waiting to see if President Trump opens up any of those events as we head later into the afternoon and look for any developments when it comes to the conflict in Iran. Keep it here. This is Bloomberg.